We are not yet finished with our network diagram, as we must now complete our backward pass. Backward pass analysis is the process of moving from the finish of the network backwards towards the start of the network through all the paths to determine the latest start date and latest finish date for each activity. The latest start date, or LS, in our schedule is the date that represents the latest date that the activity can start without delaying the entire project. The latest finish date, or LF, in our schedule is the date that represents the latest date that the activity can finish without delaying the entire project. Late start and late finish for each activity are found by working backward through the network, the backward pass. The late finish is determined based on the late start from the successor activity, and the late start of each activity is determined by taking its late finish minus its duration to equal its late start. Let's work through an example to illustrate how we determine the late finish and late start, and how we use this information to determine the float or the slack. In the last section, we calculated our early start and early finish dates. For the backward pass, we start with the last activity in our diagram. The last activity in our project is activity F. We will move backward, right to left, through the network in the backward pass. We start by assigning the late finish for activity F as the finish for the project, which is day 31. We calculate the late start by taking the late finish of 31, subtracting the 10-day duration for activity F to get a late start of 21. This means that activity F has the same date for both the earliest start date and the latest start date. It cannot be started any earlier or any later. This is an indication that activity F is on the critical path, which we know that it is. We now continue to work backward through our network diagram. We move to activity E. The late finish for activity E is equal to the late start of its successor activity F. So the late finish for activity E is 21. We calculate the late start for activity E by taking the late finish of 21 and subtracting the activity E duration of 4 to arrive at a late start for activity E of 17. Again, we see that activity E has the same earliest start date as it does the latest start date. Activity E is a critical activity. Continuing backward, we arrive at activity D. The late finish for activity D is the late start of its successor, activity E, which is 17. We calculate the late start for activity D by taking the late finish of 17 and subtracting the activity D duration of 7 to arrive at a late start of 10. Notice for activity D, the earliest start date is day 3 in our schedule. The latest start date is day 10 in our schedule. This represents a flexibility or float of 7 days, the difference between the latest start and earliest start. That means that activity D can start as late as day 10 and not delay our project finish. This 7 days represents the float or the slack for activity D. Any activity that has float is not a critical activity and is not on the critical path. Continuing backward, we arrive at activity C. The late finish for activity C is the late start of its successor, activity E, which is 17. We calculate the late start for activity C by taking the late finish of 17 and subtracting the activity C duration of 3 to arrive at a late start for activity C of 14. Activity C is a critical activity. Continuing backward, we arrive at activity B. The late finish for activity B is the late start of its successor activities C and D. Activity C has a late start of 14, and activity D has a late start of 10. In the backward pass, we take the smaller of the two late start values to determine the late finish for activity B. So the late finish for activity B is 10. We calculate the late start for activity B by taking the late finish of 10 and subtracting the activity B duration of 3 to arrive at a late start for activity B of 7. Notice that activity B has float. It can be delayed by 7 days without affecting the end date of our project. Continuing backward, we arrive at activity A. The late finish for activity A is the late start of its successor, activity C, which is 14. We calculate the late start for activity A by taking the late finish of 14 and subtracting the activity A duration of 14 to arrive at a late start for activity A of 0.